In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's F. Scott's Fitzgerald Golden Orange. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is an absolutely beautiful red-leaning orange. Golden orange indeed. A perfect name. I am loving this ink. It shades from a nice solid tone of an orange into an orange-leaning red. Now, the beauty of this ink is easily lost with the wrong pen or the wrong paper. What you see now is a medium flow broad, and it is beautiful. In the writing sample, though, on the non-fountain pen paper, it will be much more red than it really does it for me, which leaves me really kind of divided on this ink. I love the tone that's going down right now that you're seeing. When it becomes much more red, I just feel kind of like, yeah, that's an ink, and I'm not exactly sure if that's what I want to be using on a regular basis. So the thing that I run into there is, what paper am I using most? That's going to help guide the decision of whether or not I choose to seek a bottle of this in the future. I have marked my page so that I can come back and look at it again, perhaps re-explore it for myself. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the standard AmPad nib, this is pretty wet, and we really are getting that much more of a red. Not what we saw before, but I guarantee it is the same ink. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. Actually, as a red, it's a very deep, rich red. It looks very nice. It was not expected after I did the initial writing with it to then get it like this. The gold nib turned out to be a little bit drier flowing. Wasn't exactly sure on that. Now with that, we get on the majority a lighter tone than we had with the standard. It's not going to feather, it's not going to spread, it is giving us some of the shading, and it's doing a fairly good job. You see traditional has it, second line, practice, honoring, brilliant, definitely there, but what I'm seeing here is more of a red to a dark red because it's a much wetter pen than the Levenger. Looking at the Fudain nib, it is very dark, like we had with the standard Flex. It has no feather, it has no spread, it is shading fairly well. We're not getting a whole lot of the orange that I was seeing before, and I'm not going to harp on that except in the next one just because it's the first non-fountain pen paper. This paper, I was very surprised to not get those orange tones. Surprised is a nice word, disappointed is what I felt. So choose your paper wisely. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, just a good performance, as always on this paper. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Noodler's AHAB with an extra fine nib. A Noodler's AHAB with a medium nib. A Noodler's AHAB with a 1.1 stub nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, we get no feather. Well, maybe a little bit. It's a bit wetter, but I think the feathering that's occurring is certainly under control. You see it on the second line loss, third line greater. Not a whole lot anywhere else, mostly on the left side of the page. We're not experiencing any kind of spread. We are experiencing some shading. We even do get to see a little bit of the orange here, but mostly because of the absorbent nature of the paper, and in the future, we're going to really see a red. Looking at the gold nib, it doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It is certainly a lighter tone than we had with the standard AHAB nib. With it being a lighter tone, I lied in the last one in. This will be really almost the only time that we get to see some of the orange into red. It does show up here on the second, third, and fourth line. It shades nicely. It does really well. The orange isn't looking as good on this paper as it did in the Nib notebook from the beginning. Looking at the Fude nib, it is darker than we had with the gold nib, not quite as dark as we had with the standard. It's not feathering, surprising, really, considering. It's not spreading. It is shading, but it's not shading from orange to red. It's shading from a light red to a dark red, which leaves us very disappointed about the tone of this ink, considering kind of expecting an orange. Looking at the back of the page, you see the ink got very deep into the paper. However, none of it came through and touched the page underneath, so the bleeding was under control. I just don't think you could use the back of the page and be able to read both sides easily. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, the most noticeable thing is this is red. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. Now, it's shading very well if you want your reds to shade. Let's ignore the fact that I don't like shading reds. The shading that's going on is doing it incredibly well. You see it in the second line even, dark to light to dark, at light to dark. In most every word, you get to see some shading, and it comes through very nicely. So if you want that shading red, here's a really good option. Looking at the gold nib, we see we get about the same tone that we had with the standard AHAB nib. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. The thing is, while it is still shading very well, I actually think it shaded better in the first one with the standard nib than it is with this gold nib. And when I'm seeing that, I find that a little unusual because they're not that different other than the materials. However, this gold nib is tipped, and that standard AHAB one is not. Looking at the Fude nib, it is in general darker than everything else we had on the page. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading. It's not horrible as a red. It's doing fairly well. And as a shading ink, it's doing extremely well. It's an orange. I said I wasn't gonna. I can't help it. This is an orange ink. It looks red. And some of that feeling divided is sort of getting lost in all of this red. Looking at the back of the page, we see that the Ghosting's fair. You may be able to get away with using the back of the page if you weren't using wetter pens. Wet pens you can't, but it does not bleed through and touch the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook.
Looking at the standard AHAB nib, we still have red. It's not feathering, so we'll call that good. It's not spreading. We'll also call that good. It is shading. We'll call that in general a good thing. It's doing it fairly well. The change in color is not huge and powerful all the time. It's little, like you're going to see in the second line in the word little, by little. And it's there quite frequently, going from just a bit lighter to just a bit darker and back and forth. Very nice. Looking at the gold nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the standard nib. It is not feathering, so it's doing great. It is not spreading, and it is doing great, but this paper typically does very well. It is shading. Even with the tone of the paper, even with the tone of some of these papers, it has managed to shade beyond that. It is shading, I think, a little more noticeable than we had on the standard AHAB nib, which is rather interesting because they're not very different other than material. Looking at the Fude nib, we have a darker tone than we've had on this page. A lot darker. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading incredibly well. A lot. You see it all the way through, even on the years later where somehow I've managed to take two words and make one out of it magically. Watch those tails in your cursive writing. I am sloppy. Looking at the back of the page, I have to draw attention to that dot that I circled that did touch the page underneath. I don't know how, but I can use that back of the page. This back of the page I can use because the ghosting is not out of control.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Aurora. Here is Diamine Pumpkin. Here is Mont Blanc Ink of Joy. Here is Sailor Kobe number 8. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook.
Looking at the standard AHAB nib, we have a red that's not feathering, that is not spreading, that is not shading, but it is a solid performing red. Now, if this wasn't an orange and it was just a solid performing red, I'd have nothing but great things to say about it. However, let's go ahead and say something mean, like, you're supposed to be orange and you're red. You are confused, sir. Looking at the gold nib, we get a little less confusion as it tries to be a lighter red. Sorry, you, sir, are still red. It is not feathering. It is not spreading. It is shading. Always amazes me when it inks shade on less than premium paper. It's doing it really well. I can't help but actually give it props for that. I just have to knock it down a notch because you are orange, not red. Looking at the Fude nib, you can't help but notice that it is red and not orange. I am beating this dead horse back to life. Yes, I am. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading. It is doing really well in all of those things as a red ink. But you are orange, so you are wrong. You are wrong. Bad. Bad ink. You put your, no. Bad. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is way under control. You can easily use the back of this page. There was no bleed through to touch the page underneath. It did incredibly well as a red ink, except it's orange.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Califolio Bleu Atlantique. Here is a green ink by Caran d'Ache, their Chromatics Vibrant Green. Here is a purple ink by KWZ, their Gray Plum. Here is a brown ink by Papier Plume Pecan. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the standard AHAB nib, it's red, yes, I know. I'm going to try to leave the dead horse alone, but I've almost got it back to life. It is feathering, which we expect on this paper, so I don't hold it against it. It is spreading, but both of those are very minor, very under control, which means, depending on how it does on the back, it could be doing really well. It's not shading. We don't expect shading on copy paper, so not getting it is not a disappointment. Looking at the gold nib, it is a little bit lighter in general, I think, than we had with the standard AHAB nib. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Both of those are well under control. You could use them without any real loss to this orange. Red. Orange ink, red. It's not shading. We don't expect that, although if this orange red did shade like we saw initially and like we're going to see in the end, it would be amazing. Looking at the Fude nib, we see that the tone is roughly what we had with the gold nib. It does feather, it does spread, neither of those a big deal. Here is some shading that's going on, so it can shade with the Fude nib. We've beaten the red horse back to life again. If only it had been an orange one, we'd be much happier. There is an absolute redeeming quality to this ink, is that it only bled through and touched the page underneath with the Fude nib. Otherwise, not. Seeing the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is, well, out of control. You can't use the back of the page, but it doesn't corrupt the page underneath. So it does get a win as a red ink.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Now, in order to get that orange that I would prefer, you need to be using a premium paper, and not just any premium paper, but a premium and a white, maybe slightly off-white would work. Medium flow broad, like you're seeing here right now, really does it hands down. It is gorgeous. Now, that's for the orange, and it is amazing. I think I've broke myself of this ink. If you do like the red, or you want much more of the red, or you use non-fountain pen paper, expect red with any kind of wet pen. It'll be red on cheap paper or with a wet pen. You have been warned. It's not orange.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.